Now, the Emir of Kano, Mohammed Sanusi II, has described as a liability the nation's population, which currently stands at over 190 million. He was speaking at a panel discussion yesterday at the Nigeria Economic Summit meeting in Abuja. The Emir attributed the spate of kidnapping, armed robbery, insurgency, farmers' herders crisis to the level of population growth.
This population problem is perhaps the most important developmental challenge we have to face. If we don't have a demographic transition, we will never have an economic transition, and that is a fact. The second thing is we need to have a greater nuance in looking at population and demography, because Nigeria is one country, but it's many countries in many respects. Fertility rates in some parts of this country are like 8 child per woman. In other parts, they're 3. We talk about a population growth of 3-point-something% in Nigeria. The reality is that most of that is coming from the northeast and the northwest.
Well, as President Muhammadu Buhari prepares to present the 2020 draft budget before the joint session of the National Assembly, former Chief Economic Advisor to the President, Dr. Magnus Bacall, joins us from our Abuja studio to make sense of some of the matters arising. We'd like to welcome you to the program. Let's start with the blueprint of this administration. Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, ERGP. Are we on track?
Well, thank you. We're on track if the economy is growing. I think that we can grow a bit faster than we are growing right now. When we start to see growth rates under 2%, then we are not as encouraged as we would like to be. So, but I think that the president has said the right things, and it looks like the budget is sort of pointing in the right direction. The problem is that the budget, as a percent of GDP, is small. We have a budget that if you use 360 naira to the dollar as the exchange rate, it's about $25 billion, and that, driving an economy of 400 billion leaves a lot to be expected. I think that what the government has to be aiming at is, and they've said it, they said that they want to have more inclusion. So what that means is they need to be more catalytic to be sure that the private sector is involved. We have to activate the economy in a stronger manner. We need to have a little bit more cooperation between policy, academia, and the private sector. I think it's a tripod that Nigeria has tended to ignore for a long time. And that makes sure that we concentrate on investments in people. And so I'm hoping that in the process, when you talk of inclusion, you're talking about the inclusion of human beings. And at the end of the day, doesn't matter how you express your GDP numbers, what we really want to see is how does that lift the level of living? How do people fare in an environment like that? So we want to see in Nigeria where GDP growth rate it translates into well-being, where the quality of life improves. Okay. That means we need to begin to see GDP growth rates well upwards of 5%.
Professor Bacall, hold on a moment. I mean, when you look at our 2020 budget, the projections show a number of highlights, like the oil production benchmarks, the increased oil benchmark from $55 per barrel to $57. Some people are asking, are they more realistic than previous projections? And there also seems to be inevitably a bigger wage bill for the government. And the government says there might be some job cuts. I mean, do we dip in more, keep borrowing? Or, I mean, what ways can the government generate revenue to maintain a fiscal balance?
Well, that's it. The point is that the government cannot do it alone. And sometimes we pretend in our country that the government has a capacity to do it by itself. We talk about public-private partnerships. We talk about inclusion, but we don't tend to really do it. And I think we need to be a little bit more active in making sure that that happens. I think that, as I've said before, that we cannot be successful at a 2% growth rate. The oil price mark of $55, $57 a barrel, I think is realistic. I think is good. I think we're not being too optimistic and too aggressive in that regard. I think that's pretty good. The question then is, what do we do when we have a surplus? That's always been the problem. I think we should have stipulated activities that we will commit any excesses into, but we don't tend to do that. And it should be something that really, in my opinion, focuses more on the human being. We should look more aggressively at human capital development. People are talking about the future of jobs. In fact, the World Bank just realized, and they've said this, that they are quite surprised that they never looked at this in the past, that the human being represents about 66% of the wealth of nations, and therefore actually the wealth of the planet. And we talk about institutional capital, we talk about infrastructure, but we don't seem to talk much about the investments in people. So I think that that's what creates the diffusion that we want in the economy. That's what creates the action that we need to see so that the economy is revved up. If we just keep focusing on macroeconomic aggregates, sometimes which are not really realized, then it seems to me that we missed the mark. So I'm looking for an administration that looks to be looking, because when I hear about inclusion and inclusive growth, I'm believing that they are looking at investments in people. So really my focus is, how do we make sure that we pay attention to things like coding, that we look at the future of jobs? How can we be competitive vis-a-vis the Asians and the Americans and the Europeans in the labor marketplace? Where are the global skills that people need to have in order to be competitive? How are we strengthening our peasant farmers in terms of giving them human capital to be a little bit more competitive and be able to provide for food security? These are the kind of issues that I think we should be talking about.
Okay.
What impacts the human being?
We need to go now.
Yes.
As we take a break. We'd like to thank you. Still to come, we examine the renewed call from the organised labour for immediate implementation of the new national minimum wage. That's in a moment.